And I call on the Minister, Ivan McKee, to open our debate.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, this year we should be celebrating 25 years of tariff-free spirits trade between Europe and the US. Instead, we are facing 25% US tariffs on a range of Scottish products. The US is the world's largest export market for Scotch whisky, and for over a century, Scotch and US whisky industries have been closely entwined. Despite that history, today, a 2019 release Scotch whisky that spent the last 25 years ageing in US bourbon barrels, ready for tariff-free access to the US market, finds new and unwelcome obstacles in its way. Scotland is proud to be a trading nation with a plan to increase our exports to 25% of our GDP in the next 10 years, growing exports by £25 billion. Delivering that plan requires a supportive trading environment. These US tariffs directly damage Scottish business, and I will detail the specific impact shortly. However, the effects of barriers to trade are also a stark warning of the greater impact to come from the loss of tariff-free access to the EU, particularly in the case of a no-deal Brexit. And it demonstrates why Scotland's interests must be taken into account in the development of all future UK trade arrangements. I will.
Dean Lockhart.
I just wonder, thank you for giving way, if he is so concerned about a no-deal Brexit, why has the SNP voted against a deal on 4 separate occasions, including the latest withdrawal deal, which the SWA has said, and I quote, stands up well against the priorities of the Scotch whisky industry?
Minister Ivan McKee.
I know it's fine, well, or he should, that any Brexit is bad for Scotland. The people of Scotland didn't vote for Brexit, and the Scottish Government and the SNP will not support anything that damages Scotland's economy, in stark contrast to the behaviour of the Conservative Party. On 18 October, the US applied 25% tariffs on a range of products from EU countries, including the UK, in accordance with Trade Organisation rules. The imposition of those tariffs is the latest development in the long-running Airbus-Boeing saga, a dispute between the US and the EU about subsidies to the aviation industry. Next year, the EU is expecting the outcome of a WTO decision on tariffs the EU can apply to US products, tit for tat. Trade disputes may seem far removed from most people's day-to-day lives, but the impact of these tariffs on Scottish businesses and potentially on people's jobs is immediate and real. Single malt Scotch whisky, cheese, butter, cashmere and sweet biscuits, including shortbread, are targeted by the tariffs. This is profoundly worrying for Scottish producers exporting or planning to export to the US. It jeopardises the industry's own target to double its value to £30 billion by 2030, set out in Ambition 2030, the National Food and Drink Strategy. I spend much of my time talking to businesses and business associations to understand how government can best support them. I know that the impacts of these tariffs are being felt across Scotland, from the villages of Speyside to the West Coast Island distilleries and the textile manufacturers of the borders. The USA is Scotland's single biggest export market for whisky. Many single malt distilleries are located in remote and rural areas, particularly in island communities, and are often small businesses. The Scotch Whisky Association has highlighted to me that their industry is paying 62% of the UK's tariff bill in a dispute that has nothing to do with them. There is also a disproportionate impact on rural areas, Moray especially home to distilleries, food producers and cashmere manufacturers. And this is not just about whisky, indeed.
David Stewart.
Would the Minister share my view that one of the targets for this 25% tariff is indeed the small distilleries that don't have the flexibility to go into blended whisky and who mostly do single malt? These are the distilleries that are going to be highly at risk, particularly in the Highlands and Islands.
Minister.
Indeed the case, and as the member well knows that the tariffs are targeted on malt, so even within the whisky industry there is a disproportionate impact. And it's not just about whisky. Biscuit and shortbread manufacturers are also badly affected. One major manufacturer exports approximately 5,000 tonnes of shortbread a year to the USA, supporting 200 jobs. I know from my experience in business that margins, particularly for small businesses, can be tight, and any changes in the trading environment that makes a product less competitive or reduces margin can have a big impact on profitability and on jobs. And this is a situation in which there are no winners. When I was in Washington last month, I met representatives from the US spirits industry. They also stressed the impact of these tariffs on their businesses, including potential job losses in the US. Scottish ministers and officials have taken the steps we can to encourage a resolution to this dispute. I know that the EU is working towards a negotiated settlement with the US, and we support them in this approach. The First Minister recently wrote to the Prime Minister, highlighting the threat to the Scotch whisky industry. I also raised this with the UK Trade Minister Conor Burns in October, and we have urged the UK Government to work with the EU to find a solution. In October, I raised the impact of these tariffs on Scottish exports with the Assistant US Trade Representative in Washington, DC, the US Consul General in Edinburgh, and the US Embassy in London. Presiding Officer, this year we should be celebrating 25 years of tariff-free trade on spirits between Europe and the US. Last year, we celebrated a tariff-free trade arrangement that's twice as long, with the 50th anniversary of the EU Customs Union. For most of that time, Scotland has had tariff-free access to the EU market. The impact on Scotland of these targeted US tariffs on specific sectors is a stark warning of the far greater challenges that await Scotland if we lose tariff-free access to the EU across a wider range of sectors. As members know, the Scottish Government believes that the best option for the future well-being of Scotland is to remain in the EU. That position is consistent with the will of the people of Scotland, who overwhelmingly voted to remain. The benefits of EU membership to Scotland are clear. The EU is the largest single market for Scotland's international exports. Estimates show that EU trade barriers could cost the UK between 4 and 7% in lost GDP growth by 2030, while the UK Treasury's own figures show that signing free trade agreements with all of the English-speaking countries, including the US, and with all of the BRICS emerging economies together, would only, by contrast, increase GDP by a maximum of 0.4%. Any form of Brexit will cause significant harm to Scotland's economy and result in lower household incomes. But a no-deal Brexit could push the economy into recession in 2020. This stark conclusion is set out in the Scottish Government's report, No Deal Brexit, Economic Implications for Scotland. This could see unemployment rise by up to 100,000 and exports fall by up to 20%. If we Brexit with no deal, then the EU will have no choice but to impose the same tariffs on us as it does on other third countries. The UK Government has conceded this could mean a loss of almost £2 billion annually to the UK's food and drink sector alone.
Alex Rodley.
For giving way, and I totally understand the arguments that he makes about tariffs. What I can't understand is how can we say that it would be a complete disaster to leave the EU having to face tariffs when 60% of our trade is with the rest of the United Kingdom, and the real danger of a hard border and tariffs if we go down your road of separation?
Minister Ivan McKee.
Well, the member will be very well aware that it's the position of the Scottish Government that there should be no tariffs between Scotland and the rest of the UK, or indeed with the EU, because we intend to maintain our membership as a full member of the EU after independence. And if what he's saying is that the position of the UK is that they would erect tariff barriers between the UK and the EU, then I think that talks more to the UK's attitude to international trade than that of Scotland, where we seek to do what we can to protect business and not put barriers in their way. There are those who argue that these US tariffs are an EU issue and will be solved by Brexit, but that displays a deep misunderstanding of the situation. Leaving the EU will not remove the UK's current UF tariff liabilities relating to UK subsidies to Airbus. Instead, it clearly demonstrates two things. One, that a so-called clean break, no-deal WTO Brexit is a fallacy. This dispute shows that the free-trading UK of the Brexiteers' dreams will still be subject to a supranational rules-based body, one with teeth, as this dispute has demonstrated, just one based in Geneva rather than Brussels. And secondly, it demonstrates the difficulties the UK will face in negotiating a free trade agreement with the US, a country unpredictable at best and one which drives a very hard bargain. The Airbus WTO tariffs give the US a strong card to start with, one they won't give away through a love of the UK, but will seek to exchange for who knows what: food standards, access to our NHS. And the UK in that situation will find itself potentially, even without the counterweight of the WTO Boeing ruling in the EU's favour to balance the scales. The imposition of US tariffs indicates why Scotland's economic and other interests and priorities must be taken into account in the development of future trade arrangements. While there are similarities, there are also differences in what and where Scotland trades compared to the rest of the UK. Scotland has valuable protected geographical indications such as Scotch whisky, Scottish farmed salmon and Scotch beef, which are crucial to our export performance and growth. Our approach to trade also differs from the UK as a whole, with a specific set of values that reflect the priority that we give to protecting the environment, our public services and workers' rights. A year ago, the Scottish Government published Scotland's role in the development of future UK trade arrangements, which made the case strongly that the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government must have guaranteed roles in formulating and agreeing future trade deals. A year on, these issues are as relevant, if not more so, with the UK Government talking up the benefits of a US trade deal. This Parliament has previously called upon the UK Government to engage in a process with the Scottish Government and the other devolved administrations which ensures that the interests and priorities of all parts of the UK are represented. I reiterate that call today. Presiding Officer, these US tariffs have seen Scotland caught up in a trade dispute not of our making. They have a direct impact on Scottish businesses, but post-Brexit tariffs with the EU would multiply the scale of this impact on the Scottish economy. Our healthy current trade with the US shows that we do not need to leave the EU to trade successfully with the US. What we need is a trading environment that allows our businesses to thrive and that is supportive of what and how Scotland trades. We can increase our exports to 25% of our GDP in the next 10 years, but Scotland's voice must be heard and our interests represented in future trade deals. Presiding Officer, I move the motion in my name.
Thank you very much, Minister. And now call on Dean Lockhart to open for the Conservative Party.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. This is a very important debate. Everyone across this chamber will recognise the importance of the Scotch whisky and other sectors affected by US tariffs arising from a trade dispute between the EU and the US. Let me first deal with the Scotch whisky industry and the significant contribution it makes to Scotland's economy, Scotland's trade and the huge levels of tax revenues it generates to support public services in Scotland. Scotch whisky accounts for over £4 billion of international sales, making it one of the largest exporting sectors in the UK. It employs more than 11,000 people across Scotland and many more indirectly through supply chains, with the majority of these jobs being in rural Scotland. On 18th of October this year, an import tariff of 25% was imposed on all single malt Scotch whisky and Scotch whisky liqueurs entering the US market. These tariffs are the latest chapter in a 15-year trade dispute between the US and the EU over subsidies for Airbus and Boeing. And these tariffs follow a related decision last year by the EU Commission to impose tariffs on US whisky. All of this means that Scotch whisky and some of our other vital sectors have become collateral damage in a much wider EU-US trade dispute. In the words of the Scotch Whisky Association, Scotch is now caught up in a multi-dimensional trade dispute between the EU and the US. A 25% EU tariff has applied to US whiskies since July 2018. Despite our vocal opposition and calls for this to be removed, this will have contributed to the US decision. These US tariffs will affect single malt exports worth over $500 million going into the US. And the SWA have said that exports of single malt to the US could decline by some 20% over the next year if these tariffs continue. That amounts to a decline of over $100 million a year in exports. So this is clearly an important issue for all of us to address. Presiding Officer, in response to the imposition of US tariffs, the Scotch whisky industry has made a number of reasonable requests of the UK and Scottish governments. First, they have called for the Scottish and UK governments to work together to encourage EU and US authorities to reach a negotiated settlement of the dispute. To this end, I very much welcome the action taken by the Prime Minister, who has raised this issue directly with the US President a number of times. The UK government has also approached the WTO to confirm that the UK has been fully compliant with rulings on Airbus tariffs and should therefore not be subject to these tariffs. Pending a resolution to this trade dispute, the Scotch whisky sector has also proposed a number of targeted measures that can be taken to support the industry. These measures include reducing the tax burden on spirits and reforming excise duty to minimise the competitive disadvantage of Scotch whisky. This is a reserved matter, and I'm very pleased to report that the UK Government last week announced it will review alcohol duty to ensure that the UK tax system provides much-needed support to the UK drinks industry. This follows the UK budget last year, in which spirits duty was frozen at the request of Scottish Conservative MPs in Westminster. The whisky sector has also called for the exclusion of glass from the Scottish Government's deposit return scheme to reduce the regulatory burden on whisky producers. So let me ask the Minister whether he will listen to the Scotch whisky sector and today rule out the inclusion of glass in the deposit return scheme. The sector has also highlighted problems arising from the painfully slow rollout of superfast broadband in rural areas, which is affecting countless distilleries. So again, can I ask the Minister today to explain to the sector why his government is failing to meet targets for the rollout of superfast broadband and what steps he is taking to address this issue, which has been raised by the sector? Presiding Officer, the Scotch whisky and other sectors impacted by these tariffs are too important to get caught up in politics, and that's why our motion today calls on the Scottish Government to work closely with the UK Government to address these issues. I'll give way to Bruce Crawford if he can explain what steps his party is taking to address the measures raised by the SWA.
Bruce Crawford.
What I will do, Presiding Officer, is ask Dean Lockhart to explain just how much of the £600 million has been put in by governments in the UK to the rollout of improved broadband in Scotland has come from the UK Government. The answer, zero.
Dean Lockhart.
Well, as Bruce Crawford knows, the responsibility to implement the rollout is the Scottish Government's. And in terms of funding, if Bruce Crawford, as convener of Finance Committee, wants to talk about funding, he'll be well aware of the extra £2 billion coming to the Scottish Government as a result of an increase of the UK block grant. Yes. Presiding Officer, let me turn to the Scottish Government motion today and the reference to Brexit. Because I will in a second, let me just make a bit of progress, but I will give way. By mentioning Brexit in the context of US tariffs being imposed on Scotch whisky, the Minister is actually undermining his very own policy on Brexit. The only reason Scotch whisky and other sectors are being hit with US tariffs is because we are still members of the EU. And because in this trade dispute, the EU has prioritised the interests of European aerospace, French champagne and other European sectors at the expense of Scotch whisky. The reality is that after Brexit, we will be free to negotiate our own free trade agreements with the rest of the world. We can then prioritise the interests of Scotland's whisky, fishing, agricultural and other vital sectors. And let me remind the Minister that the SNP policy is to take Scotland back into the common fisheries policy, which will damage fishing communities, to take us back into the common agricultural policy, which will damage Scottish farmers, and to take us back into EU-wide free trade agreements, which, as we can now see, prioritise European exports at the expense of Scotch whisky. And I'll give way if I have a bit more. I don't have...
Yes, if you wish.
I'll give way to the Minister.
McKee.
I'm really struggling to know where to start with this complete catalogue of distractions. In terms, first of all, of cooperation with the UK Government, the Scottish Government has produced document after document to sit down and talk to the UK Government about future trading arrangements, and they're not talking to us about that. That's the problem. And in terms of prioritising of sectors, the member should be aware that the UK is also implicated in the ruling and is named in the US tariffs specifically because of the UK's support also for Airbus. That's the reality of it. And if the UK wasn't a member of the EU, it would still be liable for those tariffs. That is the reality. I've had those conversations with USTR. I've had those conversations with the US Embassy in London. That's the reality of it. That would be part of the trade negotiation with the US. So to pretend that exiting from the EU solves this problem is completely incorrect.
Hold on just a minute. I'm in control here. Please stand up, Mr. Lockhart. We do have time to have allowed that intervention, and you do have time to respond to it. Could I remind all members that there are terms of motion and amendments here on the order paper that really should be adhered to. Mr Lockhart.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Talking about the motion today, the Scottish Government highlights their concerns about a no-deal Brexit. If the SNP are so concerned about a no-deal Brexit, why have they voted 4 times against a deal that the SWA has said, and I quote, stands up well against the priorities of the Scotch whisky industry? The SNP are the party of no deal. Presiding Officer, the Minister should have come to this chamber today with a series of measures to help Scotch whisky and the other sectors affected by these tariffs. Instead, he has come to this chamber today with nothing to offer those sectors, just a list of political points to make. The Scotch whisky, cashmere and other sectors affected by these tariffs deserve better from the Scottish Government. At least they can still rely on a UK Government which has taken urgent and effective measures to
Mr.
support
Lockhart,
their
just closing.
business. I move the amendment in my name, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Call Rhoda Grant for around 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's deeply disappointing that the US has decided to inflict tariffs on iconic Scottish produce. And this should, however, really not surprise us. We've seen across the globe how the US uses its might to inflict its will on other nations because of their disproportionately large market. And what is frightening is that the US market may well be something we're depending upon in the near future, and neither does it augur well that the WTO allowed this to happen. The size of the tariff at 25% is not only punitive, it's deeply damaging to our produce going forward. Malt whisky has been drawn into the dispute. We have seen a resurgence in Scotch whisky in recent years, providing jobs and an economic boost. On the back of this, we've also had created a new market for gin. While new distilleries wait for their whisky to mature, they produce gin. It does not have to be aged and provides a steady income for those fledgling distilleries until their whisky has aged. The US is the largest market for Scotch whisky, worth £1 billion last year, and these tariffs could cost the industry 20% of their sales in malt whisky at a value of $103 million. These tariffs have implications for food sales as well. Meat, cheese, biscuits are among those affected. Walkers, famous for their shortbread, export 10% of their products to the US, and this concentrates around the festive season. Should those tariffs continue into the new year, this would affect their annual sales. Cashmere and other wool products have also been hit, another high-quality product, and sadly, most of those products come from the Highlands and Islands, a region that struggles economically, and the attack on those sectors will have a disproportionate impact, and if they are not addressed quickly. The size of the tariff makes it impossible to be absorbed for any length of time if this situation continues, and it could lead to falls in sales and ultimately job losses. Brexit has led to discussions about new markets and how we need to expand our trade base. President Trump has made it clear that he is keen to do business. Unfortunately, these tariffs show the manner in which he does business. With the EU, we had a voice at the table, a veto and equal partners with other member states. We have no such deal with America. They've shown that they're not reasonable, and our economy will be at their whim if we become too dependent on that trade. Therefore, should Brexit happen, we need to maintain very close trading relationships with the EU. We will not have the same voice, but we will need to ensure that we are not too dependent on one market. Despite this, we're still rolling out the red carpet for Trump, not just around his development at the Many estate. Earlier this year, it was discovered that the state-owned Glasgow Prestwick Airport had been waiving service fees for inbound US military aircraft. Despite this, we're penalised. It is therefore foolish to reject our close trading partnerships with those who bear us loyalty. That's it, and the biggest market for Scottish produce is the rest of the United Kingdom. While we discuss these damaging tariffs and how they affect our trading relationship with the US going forward, we also discuss the implications with Brexit on our trade with Europe. It makes no sense, therefore, at all that the Scottish Government continue to talk about separation from the rest of the UK. Separating us from our largest market makes no sense whatsoever. It would leave us even more at the whim of other countries and their trade deals. If Brexit has taught us anything, it's surely this. We damage our country and create division by constitutional wrangling. The uncertainty damages the economy regardless of the outcome. We alienate our closest friends. I have to say that there is enough of this already. If all the... Yeah.
Alistair Allen.
I thank the member for giving way. If the United Kingdom is regrettably hell-bent on leaving the European Union, will have a policy on trade of its own. Can the member explain exactly what influence, based on the experience of recent years, Scotland can expect to have on such a trade policy, and why it wouldn't be better to have one of our own?
Rhoda Grant.
I think the member is trying to say that as part of the European Union, we have a greater say on trade policy than we would have as part of the United Kingdom. That makes no sense to me at all. We would have the same or greater influence on the UK trade policy than we do have on the EU trade policy, simply because of the numbers game. The number of MEPs we send to Europe is a lot less than the number of MPs we send to the UK, and it makes no sense. That argument makes no sense whatsoever.
The member does understand an independent Scotland, as a full member of the EU, would also have a place at the Council and also have a Commissioner.
Rhoda Grant.
The other 27 countries, we need to agree first.
Yeah, well, indeed, as part of 27 countries rather than as a family of nations of 4 countries. That still makes no sense. And neither does the fact that there is no guarantee to be in the EU. I think the Minister knows to join the EU we would need to join the Euro, something that they have decided against. So I don't think there are any guarantees with what the Minister is putting forward, and I think we would be much better served by remaining as part of the UK and indeed as part of Europe.
Here, here.
Could you move your amendment, Ms Grant?
I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much. Mike Rumbles, around 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The Liberal Democrats believe that today's motion rightly makes it clear that any Brexit will be damaging to our economy and particularly our food and drink industry. The motion also highlights the fact that a no-deal Brexit would be even more damaging. A no-deal Brexit is simply the worst of all worlds. Even the most benign Brexit imaginable will cost our economy 2 to 8% of growth over the next decade, and that is according to the UK government's own figures. And that's why I am genuinely astonished at Dean Lockhart's contribution on behalf of the Conservatives this afternoon, as far as I understand it, who used to pride themselves as sound on the economy. What does their amendment do? It removes the reference to the economic damage any kind of Brexit will have, and that's recognised by the Conservative UK government, and you remove it, and will have on the British economy. How the Conservatives have changed, certainly in this chamber, I don't know about them elsewhere, but the Conservative Party in this chamber has changed dramatically, and it's not for the better. Businesses cannot simply uproot decades of trade and investment with our partners in the EU and suddenly find new buyers and new markets that did not exist before. It takes years of investment and development for a business to break into new markets, particularly the US market, which has so many local competitors. Despite the current US President's warm words about Brexit, his actions, aggressive nationalism and protectionism tell a completely different story. His values are not the values we share. Everyone loses from escalating trade wars. Are we about to do a great and beneficial deal with Mr. Trump? I think not. Whiskey, wool, clothing and blankets, biscuits, books, cheese, meat, butter, seafood and fruit. These trade tariffs will be a bitter blow to our rural economy and deeply damaging to people's jobs on both sides of the Atlantic. What is clear, however, is that this is an example of the type of behaviour we'll face if Brexit forces us into the hands of a US trade deal wished for by Mr. Trump. Thankfully, the EU remains the largest export region for Scottish whisky, and rather than turning our back on it, we must maintain as much frictionless trade as possible. Indeed, Brexit will create barriers with our largest export partner. A different trade deal with the US will be no substitute for what we already have as part of the EU. Resorting to tariff barriers is in no one's interests. Low tariffs and free trade as long as standards are maintained, and that's important, as long as standards are maintained, underpin prosperity and jobs in the UK and globally. Other EU leaders have been clear in their condemnation of US trade tariffs, but because of Brexit, the UK government is living, in my view, in fear of jeopardising any future trade talks. The whisky industry alone estimates there could be a loss of £228 million in revenue, and 3,000 jobs, mainly in rural Scotland, could be affected by these US tariffs. The impact on the wool and whisky industries in Scotland may also have a detrimental impact on our tourism industry as well. The European Union is the biggest market for Scottish products, including whisky, 30% by value, 36% by volume. However, the fact that single malts, as we've heard, are being targeted as particularly damaging for smaller producers who stand to be the hardest hit. But what I find particularly reprehensible about the current soundbite being offered by the UK government at the moment is, let's get Brexit done. It's a fraud. If it happens by the 31st of January, unfortunately, if it does, one thing is sure, Brexit will not be done. There will be years of wrangling with the EU over future trading arrangements and years of wrangling trying to establish new trade. You're shouting at me, but do you want to be an intervention? I'm perfectly happy to give way.
Oliver Mundell.
I thank you very much to the member, and sorry for shouting across the chamber. All I was saying was if the Brexit deal goes through the House of Commons, we will actually have left the EU, which is what the people of the United Kingdom voted for.
Mike Rumbles.
The people of the United Kingdom certainly did vote for that. But I stand by the principles that I was elected to this Parliament with, and I would have hoped other members who shared a particular view would have stood by their principles too. Not Mr. Mundell particularly, because he took a particular different view than I did on this. But we are, I'm trying not to refer to the general election really, but I really must, in response there, to say that, yes, we did have a referendum 3 years ago. The UK is facing a general election. And it's up to the people of the UK to decide what they want to do in that general election. The general election, I'm afraid, in my view, trumps a referendum. The general election is really important, and it's up to the people of the UK to decide their future direction. And I hope, personally speaking, and on behalf of my party, that we don't leave the EU at the end of the 31st of January, but that's up to the British people. So Brexit cannot be done. And I think if people believe this soundbite, then there'll be, I'm afraid I'm in my last minute, I think, will be very more disillusioned people after the January the 31st when they see that Brexit simply can't be just done. Deputy Presiding Officer, Liberal Democrats are clear that the best deal for the UK, including for Scottish food and drink, is for us to stay in the EU. The only way to end this Brexit madness is to stop it in its tracks, and we'll soon see whether the British people take this opportunity now to do just that. Thank you.
We'll now move on to the open debate. Can I remind everybody that they really should stick to the terms of the motion and amendment? I don't mind quick points in response to anything that's already been said, but please remember the terms of what the debate is this afternoon. Speeches of 6 minutes, please. I have a little bit of leeway in time. Emma Harper, followed by Peter Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to be able to speak in the debate today, and I note that the motion states that the Parliament regrets the recent imposition of tariffs by the United States on a range of Scottish goods. This includes single malt Scotch whisky, liqueurs, cheese, butter, biscuits, that's our shortbread, and wool and cashmere products, and that's already been mentioned. I represent South Scotland region, and I feel it is important to speak up for businesses that could potentially be affected by these terrible Trump-imposed tariffs, including Spirit Aerosystems, who operate out of Prestwick Airport and have a contract with Airbus. The sooner a resolution is found, the better. No one benefits from trade wars. No one benefits from these trade tariffs. We must urge the United States and the EU negotiators to find a solution to the Airbus and Boeing dispute, which is now having a complete knock-on effect for our Scottish businesses. Presiding Officer, when addressing the motion before us, it is important to start by understanding how we ended up in this situation. The issue has arisen because of a dispute over the EU providing subsidies to aerospace giants due to their manufacturing of assets in France, Germany, Spain and the UK. Again, it's important to note that this dispute is not new. It is worth restating that it's the latest chapter in a 15-year battle between the US and the EU over perceived illegal subsidies for these airplane manufacturers, Airbus and Boeing. The US first called a case with the World Trade Organization against the EU in 2004, arguing that European loans supporting Airbus amounted to illegal state subsidies. The EU and subsequently the European Union Council, and by extension its member states, voted to fight the case. The legal battle came to a head this year after the World Trade Organization ruled in favour of the US government, leaving the EU, UK and Scotland with no choice other than to accept the unwanted and damaging imposition of £6.1 billion worth of tariffs. This dispute began with airplanes, but the Scottish produce that is now affected has nothing to do with aviation. The punitive tariffs are a risk to real jobs and real investment. Presiding Officer, the US is the world's largest export market for Scotch whisky, and that's been noted already. 11,000 people employed and 7,000 are in rural areas. We even have 2 distilleries in Dumfries and Galloway now, Bladnoch and Annandale, and that could potentially be affected as well.
Could the member take an intervention?
Of course I will.
Gillian Martin.
You mentioned rural areas. Small distilleries like Glengarry in my constituency are deeply worried about these tariffs, but the industry as a whole is also concerned about the power that the US has over trade deals like this. And in a post-Brexit situation, they're concerned that the US government will want to flood the Scottish market with cheap American whisky. Is that not also a great threat to Scottish whisky and Scottish drinks in general?
Emma Harper.
Thank you, Gillian Martin. I think that actually is an issue because when I was on Finance and Constitution Committee, we did take evidence that, for me, was worrying that trade negotiators in America were already eyeing up the Scotch market to brand their own 3-year-old grain whisky as malt. So I think it is something we need to be really concerned about. So I know that when we're talking about whisky and our businesses, we know that 137 million bottles of Scotch were exported in 2018. That's 4 bottles every second. And I know that folk in the USA like their Scotch. My husband still has close links with US whisky folks, and I know they take great pride in sourcing, obtaining and sharing popular and rare brand malts from US distributors. Highlighting the impact of the imposed tariffs, it's worth noting that the Chief Executive of the Scots Whisky Association, Karen Betts, stated that this tariffs will no doubt damage the Scots whisky sector. We expect a negative impact on investment and job creation in Scotland and longer-term impacts on productivity and growth across the industry and our supply chain. These words are from the whisky industry leadership. This disruption is dangerous and it's the last thing we all need right now in this current EU exit chaos with another snap general election and Boris's Brexit bourrach. Presiding Officer, I'm keen to highlight as part of the Conservatives' amendment which states that the UK will be able to enter into free trade agreements that prioritise the interests of these vital sectors of our Scottish economy. Currently, the EU is a large trading bloc and a powerful voice in trade negotiations with our transatlantic partners. So if we want the US to take brand Scotland, then the US will have to take their brands back. So we'll have to accept their US foodstuffs. So I'm curious as to how strong the UK voice will be. And I'd like to draw members' attention to the US Food and Drug Administration's The Food Defects Levels Handbook. The FDA approved certain levels of what they term defects in food, spices and crop-based products as well. And one defect is labelled as mammalian excreta, or simply rat poo. It's listed on page 15 under cocoa beans, and it's acceptable that this defect has an amount of 10 milligrams of excreta per pound. Here's another acceptable defect. Page 12, in ground paprika. Page 12, ground paprika. The acceptable level of defect is 75 insect fragments per 25 grams. This is what US trade negotiations open us up to. And UK negotiators negotiate on behalf of Scotland. We don't have a voice in trade negotiations. I think I'm running out of time, actually. So there is no EU, UK or Scottish acceptable defect levels equivalent. I had Spice check that for me. I'd therefore be interested to know if members opposite would respect or would represent that, is it worth accepting these defects? Rat poo, rat hair, insect carcasses, and a whole host of other defects. That's what I'm worried about. Presiding Officer, I'd like to again ask the Scottish Government to do all it can to pressure both the UK Government, if we get a new one, and the EU to address these issues as soon as possible to ensure that we continue to fight against yet further issues because of Scotland being forced out of the EU. Thank you.
Peter Chapman, followed by Bruce Crawford.
I thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I will try to stick to the motion that we have in front of us today, unlike the last speech which we heard. And I welcome the opportunity to speak about the implications of the imposition of US tariffs on Scottish products. As we know, on the 18th of October, the US government applied a 25% tariff on some British food and drink exports.
Point of order, Bruce Crawford.
Can I ask you to confirm that during the...
Sorry, would you start again, Mr Crawford?
I can ask you, Presiding Officer, to confirm that during the last contribution by Emma Harper, that she indeed stick to the terms of the amendment and the motion.
It's not actually a point of order, but I have to say that I found nothing at all wrong with Ms Harper's contribution. Mr Chapman.
President Trump has stated that the EU's support for Airbus impacts on American jobs, and the US trade representative has defended the President's actions and has accused Europe of providing massive subsidies to Airbus that have seriously injured the US aerospace industry and our workers. Following the ruling, the WTO have allowed the US to impose tariffs on £7.5 billion worth of goods it imports from the EU. Presiding Officer, the UK is the country expected to be hardest hit by Trump's latest tariffs, with an annual loss of $1.4 billion. Moreover, the latest figures revealing that the whisky industry is now bearing 62% of the UK's tariff liabilities. And with the inclusion of cashmere and shortbread in the tariffs, it is clear that Scottish products will be disproportionately affected. Why whisky distillers and shortbread producers have to pay the price for disagreements over aeroplane subsidies is categorically unjust and unfair. Last year's whisky exports to America were worth $1.3 billion, translating into around 137 million bottles. And after the EU imposed a 25% tariff on the import of bourbon last year, imports of US whisky fell by about 20%. The industry on this side of the Atlantic is now expecting a similar decline in the next year, as the tariff will inevitably mean Scotch becomes less competitive in the US market. Presiding Officer, this would be a calamity for the northeast of Scotland. A huge proportion of our whisky industry is here. It must also be recognised that shortbread producers Walkers and Deans, who are also based in the northeast, will be unjustly affected too. Walkers alone exported 5,000 tonnes of shortbread, more than a tenth of its total production, to America last year. Pardon? Johnston's of Elgin, the largest manufacturer of knitwear in the UK, will also be adversely affected by the imposition of a 25% tariff. The US is its third largest market, and Chief Executive Simon Cotton has stated that this is going to hit consumers in the US, and that is going to mean their cashmere is going to become more expensive. That in turn means we will be able to export less, grow less, and we will have to downscale our plans. This is a situation that will unfairly hit industries in the northeast and rural communities, and we must do everything in our power to mitigate its effects. The Prime Minister is in constant contact with the EU and the US, including Donald Trump. and will continue his efforts to get the tariffs dropped. The Conservative government has also frozen the rate of tax on spirits over the last 2 years, supporting Scotland's national drink. He has also announced a major review of alcohol duty and signalled the industry could be in line for a tax break if he wins the general election. This is something that has been greatly welcomed by the industry, and I'm sure all of us. This is in stark contrast to the complete and utter silence that has come from the SNP and the Scottish Government. It seems to be that the party that claims to speak for Scotland does nothing to support its national drink. Presiding Officer, the fact that these tariffs have been imposed because of a disagreement between the US and the EU surely gives us even more reason to get Brexit done, so that we can strike better and more positive trade deals in the future. The decision to subsidise Airbus unfairly and to also impose a 25% tariff on US bourbon and orange juice, to name but 2 products, were decided by politicians in Brussels, not in the UK. It seems... I will.
Mike Rumbles.
I wondered if you could tell the Chamber when he believes Brexit will be done.
Peter Chapman.
Brexit will be done before the end of January of next year. So Scotland and the North East in particular will be hugely adversely affected by decisions made in Brussels rather than here in the UK. The single largest trading nation for the UK is the United States, accounting for 16% of all UK exports. We must fully grasp the opportunity of a trade deal with the US post-Brexit and maximise the potential opportunities for Scottish industries and open up new markets for our high-quality exports. To summarise, Presiding Officer, no one wins in a trade war, and we must do all we can to protect the local communities and industries affected by these tariffs. The efforts of the Prime Minister to directly deal with Donald Trump and the Prime Minister's decision to freeze the duty on spirits and review alcohol duty will no doubt help to mitigate the impacts. But what has the SNP done? As we've heard today, precisely nothing. Furthermore, we must also note the opportunity that Brexit presents us to negotiate new trade deals around the world, opening up new markets for Scotch whisky, shortbread and other world-renowned Scottish products is a great prize to be achieved. Presiding Officer.
Bruce Crawford, followed by David Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Little did we know that the special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom would be severely strained, as it is, when Donald Trump took up residence in the White House now 3 years ago. And you need look no further than the dispute over the subsidies to Airbus and the predatory response pursued in international trade by the Trump government, resulting in $7.5 billion worth of tariffs proposed for European goods for evidence of that strain. Of course, on 18th October, there was said a new tariff of 25% on single Scotch malt, whisky and Scotch whisky liqueurs entering the US came into effect. The US is the single largest market for single malt Scotch whisky, the value of exports to the US in 2018 being around $516 million. There are examples, Presiding Officer, of whisky producers in my Stirling constituency who, as Dean Lockhart put it, will be collateral damage in this trade dispute. Deanston and Glengoyne distilleries are shining examples of very high-quality Scotch whisky producers who are also locally major economic contributors and employers. Another commodity proposed for tariffs is biscuits, as we already heard. Callander is home to the oldest bakery business in Scotland. Campbell's Shortbread is a very successful company that exports worldwide, including to the USA. Biscuits produced by the likes of Campbell's also face a 25% tariff. The price for such punitive tariffs will land at the door of fantastic businesses like Campbell's and their employees. The new list of tariffs also includes dairy products, in particular cheese, and that could have a big impact on many dairy farmers in the Stirling area who rely on cheese producers, particularly cheddar producers, to buy their milk. Dairy farmers are finding trading conditions tough enough without the imposition of such tariffs. Tariffs will also apply to some woolen garments, including wool, cashmere, sweaters, pullovers, sweatshirts, waistcoats, as well as men's and boys' suits. Sheep farmers across Scotland and in Stirling constituency could see a knock-on effect from the disruption of trading in these products from companies in the United States. Now, I wrote to Ivan McKee, the Trade Minister, recently on this matter because it's causing real concern in my constituency. And in his response, as the Minister pointed out today, the First Minister has written directly to the Prime Minister on this matter. And as he told me, and he's also told the Chamber today, he's raised this matter directly with the UK International Trade Department as well as the US Government. All with the aim of urging the parties involved to work towards a settlement of the overall dispute. And just as the Scottish Government does, I too support the European Commission's efforts to reach a negotiated settlement on behalf of all of the affected member states of the European Union. Right now, the whole of the UK is facing a range of significant economic challenges brought about by the threat of Brexit in any forum. We've seen companies across these islands leave the UK, downsize their operation, collapse entirely, or halted investment decisions since the Brexit vote. I mentioned this, Presiding Officer, in a debate about US tariffs, because we've seen these tariffs imposed on an economically weakened UK. Neither will it escape notice that this attack on a number of UK products by the US government has come from the very Trump administration that Boris Johnson boasts about having a post-Brexit deal with. President Trump himself has indicated that such arrangements will only be possible with a no-deal Brexit outcome, meaning the UK government would be negotiating a trade deal whilst in a state of huge economic turmoil. The please, sir, I want some more approach from the UK we will be forced to take no doubt puts our NHS and wider public services also at risk. In addition, it would hold our industries to ransom against the protectionist agenda of Donald Trump. Neither would it be contrary to the very nature of the sitting president to change his tune at an opportune moment and drive forward damaging clauses, tariffs, restrictions to US-UK trade deals the moment the UK leaves the EU. And God forbid, Presiding Officer, it never happens. And I actually applauded loudly today the speech made by Mike Rumbles. That's not happened very often in this chamber, but he did a grand job today. I wish he was here to hear me say that. The US is not an equal trading partner to the UK, and neither does it behave like one, and anyone who thinks so, they are deluding themselves. Presiding Officer, this entire episode should be a warning to all of us of the dangers of a post-Brexit trade negotiation with the Trump administration. And I echo the calls of the Scottish Government to the UK and US governments, as well as those in the EU, to continue to work to reach a settlement that will benefit farmers and producers like those in my constituency. All of this turmoil makes it crystal clear the benefit of negotiating international trade as a partner in the European Union. And you only need to look at the value of Scotch whisky exports to the US, which grew from £280 million in 1994 to over £1 billion last year, to see the benefit of being members of the European Union while exporting to the US. And to kid on that some sort of independent trade deal done between the UK and the US would be better than that record is frankly living in fantasy land. The election is just 4 weeks away, Presiding Officer, and I urge voters to stop Brexit, call an end to the unholy alliance between Donald Trump and Boris Johnson.
David Stewart, followed by Jenny Gilruth.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and could I welcome the Scottish Government debate, but as a Highlands and Islands member, I am seriously concerned that the US tariffs will be a major red flag, a clear and present danger to quality Scottish exports in the future, such as whisky from Scalpa Distillery in Orkney, for shortbread from Walkers of Aberlour, or cashmere sweaters from Johnston's of Elgin. I want to focus my remarks, Presiding Officer, on the effects of the new tariff on the whisky industry, particularly single malt. But I want to start with the bigger picture issue. The US tariff sanction was not some random Trump-inspired maverick initiative, although, of course, there's been a fair share of these in history over the last 3 years. This was a World Trade Organization arbitrated decision based, as we've heard, on allegedly unfair EU Airbus subsidies. Now, some Brexit supporters have claimed that the WTO is a safety net for the UK. And if I can quote Ian Dunt, who wrote recently in his book Brexit, and I quote, "They portray the WTO as a virile, regulation-free wonderland, just waiting for Britain to take its place as one of the world's leading trading nations." But the reality is different, Presiding Officer, and to quote Ian Dunt again, "The WTO is a potential regulatory nightmare where each and every member can trigger a trade dispute against you." Now, with remarkable insight, Dunt, who wrote his book in 2016, predicted the current US tariffs on Scottish products. He said, "Ministers should not be under any illusions about sentimentality, even from countries like the US or Australia. The UK will be dealing with professional trade negotiations. These people squeeze you. It's what they do. Trade negotiations are not the place for a group hug," unquote. And as an aside, Presiding Officer, Scottish exporters also benefit from the EU's geographic indicator system. This is really important. So, for example, champagne must come from the Champagne region of France, Parmesan must come from one of 5 areas across northern Italy, and Stornoway black pudding, yes, you've guessed it, must come from Stornoway. So the US, of course, are not fans of this, and they prefer trademarks to geographic indicators. Now, will this be protected in a post-Brexit Britain, and what will the effects be on whisky exports? So as we've heard, from last month, there's been an ad valorem import tariff of 25% on single malt Scotch whisky and liqueurs, so ad valorem being a tax based on the value of the transactions. As we've heard from many other speakers, this is extremely serious for the industry. As we've heard, the US is the single largest market for single malt, and the value of imports is around $516 million. The Scottish Whisky Association have expressed concern that the tariffs could impact on investment and job creation in Scotland. And the key concern, as I raised in my intervention to the Minister, which I appreciate him accepting, is that smaller distilleries will be disproportionately hit, since the majority do not produce blended whisky, which is not affected by the tariff. So what about the future? Well, Presiding Officer, you would need the predictive powers of the brand seer to work out the next steps of the Brexit saga. Whilst a post-Brexit Britain could negotiate a new trade deal with the US, of course, concessions would have to be made by the UK in order to get rid of this 25%, which only takes whisky exports back to the status quo. And what would that concessions be? Access to our NHS, for example. And within Scotland, the tariff disproportionately affects my region, the Highlands and Islands, where the bulk of the distillers are located. So I believe that action is needed, first of all, to de-escalate the trade disputes. And EU-US trade issues are nothing to do with the Scottish whisky sector, yet the small distilleries in my region will pay the price for them. So how can the Scottish Government help the sector now? Well, we all know that Scottish US export market has been a success. 137 million bottles export to the US, 4 bottles per second, as we heard from Emma Harper. The key reason for this is a tariff-free trade between the EU and the US. And as the Minister pointed out in his opening remarks, since 1994, there's been a zero-for-zero agreement. The US-EU bilateral trade in spirits has grown dramatically to become the largest and most valuable single market, worth over £1 billion, very key industry. The other key point is there's been an integration of US and UK industries for over a century. The Scottish industry spends around 70 million on importing US bourbon barrels used in mature Scots. 60% of these casks come from the US because the US has a single-use policy in bourbon to protect their local industry. And the success of whisky exports to the US has helped the industry put over £500 million of investment into industrial sites in the last 5 years. Let me give you a regional example. Speyside distillers are reconsidering plans to increase exports to the US. Their managing director, Patricia Dillon, said, and I quote, "Because of the 25% tariffs that have been implemented to the US, this is something we can't possibly absorb into our business." So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, whisky is an incredibly important export for Scotland in general and the Highlands and Islands in particular. The industry has 11,000 employees, of which 7,000 are in rural areas. And the Scottish Whisky Association estimate 1/5 of single malt exports to the US could be lost in 12 months. So Baselic Scots is bearing 62% of the UK's tariff liabilities in a dispute with nothing to do with the industry. We need to de-escalate the dispute. No one wins a tariff war. It's a race to the bottom. We need to support the industry now and protect our vital rural and urban jobs. And finally, as Humphrey Bogart famously said, allegedly in his last words, I should never have switched from Scots to Martini. Thank you.
Jenny Goruth, followed by Edward Mountain.
Thank you. Cheese, olives, jumpers and whisky, not my Christmas list, presiding officer, but the items which are now being targeted by the United States thanks to new trade tariffs. These tariffs are targeting Scottish products, Scottish businesses and the livelihoods of many of our constituents as a result. And as we know, a 15-year running battle between the European Union and the United States has led to the ruling from the World Trade Organization that has allowed tariffs to begin. And US trade tariffs have now been set at 10% rate on aircraft and at a 25% rate on agriculture and other items since last month. Presiding officer, I hope that we can all agree that trade wars are in no one's interest, so it's important we focus on finding a resolution to avoid being drawn into the politics of hitting back, which seems to be the driving mission of the current US administration. As the American president tweeted in 2018, trade wars are good and easy to win. America is playing politics with the livelihoods of some of Scotland's largest employers, but bully boy tactics are the last thing we need in an era of political flux. Ahead of today's debate, my office spoke to Ian Palmer, the Managing Director of Inchdearney Distillery, which is just outside of Glenrothes. And Inchdearney began life back in 2014, but as whisky fans will understand, it has not yet produced its first bottle due to the distillation process. So until its own single malt has matured for at least a decade, Inchdearney will provide fillings for Macduff International's blends, which include Grand Macnish, Lauders and Islay Mist. The MD told me ahead of today's debate, a significant proportion of what we produce is traded within the industry, primarily for blended whisky, so the impact the tariffs will have will be indirect and long-term. The issue will be the long-term effect of the loss of sales in an important market and the ripple effect it will have on the industry in the wider sense. The tariffs will have an effect on changing the market so that when the tariffs are removed, the market will have changed and the product will have had to build up to the position that it had prior to the imposition of the tariffs. If there is a slowdown in production at some malt distilleries, this will have an effect on our trading position in the blended whisky market. The value of Scotch whisky exports to the US grew from £280 million in 1994 to over £1 billion last year. And the American market accounted for 22% of global value and 10.7% of global volumes of Scottish whisky exports in 2015. And the Scottish Whisky Association figures from last year tell us that 137 million bottles were exported to America. That's the equivalent of around 4 bottles a second. That's really important if you represent a constituency like mine, where one of the largest employers is Diageo. From leaving, Diageo packages over 38 million cases of spirits a year with a workforce of over 1,000 people. And workers in my constituency send whisky all over the world. And earlier this year, they were named as Diageo's top supply chain site, the company's top global manufacturing award. And I was delighted to welcome the Scottish Government Trade Minister Ivan McKee to Leven in August of this year to present the award to the staff at the Leven plant. Diageo is investing in its workforce and it's recognising their hard work, but they are doing so in the teeth of adversity. Even before Donald Trump's mum had left Stornoway, however, American and Scottish whisky industries had been intertwined for over 100 years, as we've heard from the Minister previously. And indeed, the SWA point to the £70 million which is spent every year importing US bourbon barrels which are used in the maturation process. Imagine hundreds of these barrels stacked to the rafters, American bourbon brands stamped on their sides, all in a storehouse at the back of a field outside the new town of Glenrothes. Our trade is global. Whether Donald Trump likes it or not, they depend on us as we do them. So we need a solution for these tariffs which are unfairly harming key Scottish industries. And I know the Scottish Government is focused on playing its part in doing all it can. And the crunch point for today's debate is obviously that under the current constitutional arrangements, any progress in terms of moving us forward depends upon Donald Trump and Boris Johnson. I don't accept that either of these individuals have the best interests of the industry or my constituents' livelihoods at heart. Today's government amendment makes direct reference to Brexit when it comes to trade. We must not ignore that elephant in the room, as the Tory amendment has done. So let me remind members about Inchdearney Distillery 38 miles from here. Inchdearney Distillery would not have been possible were it not thanks to the European Union. A grant of over £1.4 million allowed the distillery to begin life back in 2014. And how will it hurt folk in Fife? As MD Ian Palmer told me, other markets will see the impact tariffs have, and when we leave the EU, this will be a lever that they can pull in the myriad of trade negotiations which will have to happen. US trade tariffs are exactly that, a lever for economic uncertainty to exploit Scottish businesses. Thanks to the Tories and their obsession with Brexit, which of course Labour could have stopped but didn't, that exploitation will be even worse. Because the real impact of tariffs, much like Brexit, will be felt by those who can least afford it. The people who work in our distilleries, the shelf packers, the sales assistants, the folk Labour used to stick up for. Now they ride both leave and remain horses. They are all things to our people. They would rather enable a Tory government than allow this country to take a decision for itself and choose its own path. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government and this Parliament must have a meaningful role in any future trade negotiations to ensure Scotland's interests are protected. We can't just leave it to Trump and Trump Jr. Scotland has an escape route, so let's seize it. Thank you.
Still have a little time in hand, so that members are aware. Edward Mountain to be followed by Alistair Allen.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And let's be clear, I believe that tariffs are just another barrier to trade. And the Scottish Conservatives, therefore, oppose tariffs because we want to see and encourage free trade. Now, there's seldom a winner in a trade war, and this war between the European Union and the US is not in the best interests of the UK economy. That's why we support the efforts of the UK government to lobby both the EU and the US to remove the tariffs, which will hurt industries across the United Kingdom, and particularly some in Scotland. And let's not forget, as many have already said, that these tariffs came about because both the EU and US were subsidising aircraft manufacture in a way that distorted free trade. The result is, as we know, in the US imposing tariffs on the EU, who may still respond in their own right. And let me be clear, I believe they are both wrong. As a result of these tariffs, one of Scotland's greatest exporting success stories, Scotch whisky, is under threat. 25% tariff imposed on single malt whisky will hit this industry hard. The new tariffs could mean the sales of in the US drop of Scotch whisky by 20% in the first year. And it's expected that these losses in sales will get worse as long as these punishing tariffs remain in place. A drop in exports will in turn affect investment, productivity and ultimately employment for the UK's most valuable drinks export. That's bad news for the industry and it's bad news for the economy. Because we know that the Scotch whisky industry directly employs about 11,000 people in Scotland and many more through the supply chain. Over 7,000 of these jobs are in rural areas of Scotland and many in the Highlands and Islands. But it's not just Scotch whisky that's affected. Other high-quality goods produced in Scotland, such as cashmere and shortbread, will be as well. Now, that's a real concern for people in the Highlands and Islands. Walker's Shortbread, who are situated just down the road from me, and Johnson's of Elgin, also situated just down the road from me, are big names and big employers in the north. And the Highlands will end up paying for this spat if we don't get it sorted out. But it's not just them that I fear about, but it's also the many small Highland businesses who have to supply the businesses that are facing tariff. And I would have to declare at this stage that as a farmer, I produce barley that goes into Scotch whisky. Now, these businesses all operate on very tight margins, and therefore any tariffs will be very damaging to their future success. If we are to grow our food and drink industry so that it's worth the 30 billion by 2030 that we all aspire it to be, we'll need to work with the industry to mitigate the damages caused by these tariffs. And I've welcomed the UK government's decision to freeze spirit duties for the last 2 years, and I'm also delighted to hear that the UK government plans to review alcohol duty rates to ensure that we have a competitive tax system so our Scotch producers can be competitive across the world. Making these changes will provide certainty and encourage business investment despite tariffs. But more should be done, especially by the Scottish Government. Now, I received a letter only this week from a whisky producer in the Highlands asking for more help to mitigate the effects of the potential trade war. One of their main asks was for better broadband, which is a major issue for them. The Scottish Government's rollout of superfast broadband has been so painfully slow that some distilleries, I will in a minute, so that some of the distilleries can wait no longer. They have taken it upon themselves at a high cost to secure better internet connection. I'll give way to Mr Brown.
Keith Brown.
I would say I wouldn't have thought that the failures of the Tory government in terms of broadband would have been a matter that came under this motion. But on the motion himself, the member would have heard Peter Chapman say that the blame for this lies with the EU because of the sanctions that they took in the first place. The UK is a member of the EU and was party to those decisions. Does he agree with the UK position in taking those sanctions in the first place?
Edward Mountain.
Well, let's just deal with the issue of broadband to start with, because...
Can I say to, excuse me, Mr Mountain, I did talk earlier about sticking to the motion. There's no mention of broadband in the motion or in any of the amendments.
Sorry, Presiding Officer, the reason why I mentioned broadband is one, I received a letter this week from a distillery who asked for more help from the Scottish Government to help mitigate the effects of these EU tariffs. And they've asked me, therefore, to raise the matter, and I think it's a valuable point to raise.
I think you have raised the matter then, but I don't think it's something that is particularly relative to the motion or the amendments, so shouldn't be the main thrust of some of the contributions that we have heard. So please, Mr Mountain.
Presiding Officer, of course, you're always right. And therefore, I will have to curtail my speech about the need to do more to counteract the tariffs of the EU. But I do think it is really important that this Scottish Government, along with the UK Government, do all they can to help mitigate the costs of these potentially damaging tariffs, which are limiting free trade, which I think we can all agree across this chamber, Presiding Officer, are wrong. I believe our food and drink industries and our cashmere producers want to end this tit-for-tat trade war, and I wholly support them on that. I believe that we need to return to a zero-tariff conditions that have been enjoyed for the last 25 years, and I'm pleased for the UK Government is pressing for the return of this free trade. By freezing spirit duties, reviewing alcohol rates, the UK Government is doing its bit. I believe the Scottish Government could do more instead of complaining, and I wish they would. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Alistair Allen, followed by Alex Rowley.
Presiding Officer, Scotland rightly values its trading relationship with the US, and a number of members today have rightly pointed out that said the damaging nature of the tariffs being imposed by the US government. Now, I have no doubt that every member in this chamber has numerous examples from their own constituency. We've heard some of them today, be they about whisky, biscuits or cashmere, but I would like to start with one specific example from my constituency, which I think exemplifies the importance of whisky and the futility of other people's trades wars from Scotland's point of view. In my constituency, in Helen and Anir, the Isle of Harris distillery opened in 2015. Already very well known for their award-winning gin, they also distill whisky, though that is still to see the market as the first batches are still being matured in American bourbon barrels, it should be said, until they reach the optimum age. Now, the distillery started with 10 employees and now provides jobs for nearly 40 people in Harris, which, as people will know, is a fragile island economy with a total population of under 2,000 people. Now, I have little doubt that the distillery in Harris will withstand whatever the US authorities choose to throw at them, but there is no doubt that a 25% US tariff on whisky from Harris, or indeed from anywhere else in Scotland, is unhelpful to them and to the wider industry. Presiding Officer, I'm sure I don't need to elaborate on the risks which the whisky industry faces from these tariffs. After all, Harris is just one example of over 120 active whisky distilleries across Scotland, stretching from Orkney to the borders. When seen in that context, the significance of these tariffs is very considerable. Last year, £1 billion in Scotch whisky was exported to the United States, a growth of nearly 400% from 1994. We don't want to see that growth in the future being held back if Scotch whisky producers' prices increase compared to those of our counterparts or competitors across the world. Now, the value of Scotch whisky exports to the US has grown from £280 million in 1994 to over £1 billion, as I say, last year, with a third of last year's exports being in single malts, with a value of £344 million. Now, as a number of members have pointed out, that US market in single malts is particularly important. Scotch whisky, the US market accounts for 10.7% of global volumes of Scotch whisky exports, with 137 million bottles of whisky exported to America in 2018. And the fact that the new tariff applies specifically to single malt whisky, of course, hits a growing and increasingly important sector of the industry. In the words of both the First Minister and of, indeed, the UK Government's little-seen Secretary of State for Scotland, tariffs are in nobody's interest. But tariffs, it looks like there are, and whisky is not the only Scottish industry affected by them. Other Scottish products such as biscuits, shortbread, cashmere are also hit by this aggressive tariff. And while the world-famous Harris Tweed from my own constituency does not seem as if it will face any new tariffs per se as a cloth, my understanding is that the picture is somewhat less clear when it comes to garments made from it or other woolen materials. I could quote examples from Kashmir too, but the point is that the United States tariffs have a disproportionate impact on Scotland's economy. Scotland's home to the largest exporter of shortbread, as we've heard, the largest producer of cashmere knitwear, and by definition home to all Scotch whisky production. There is no doubt that Scotland is therefore, as I say, disproportionately affected by these tariffs in comparison to the rest of the United Kingdom. Now, short of delving into matters of presidential ancestry, as one or two members have, it is difficult to see what exactly Scotland or my constituency has done to deserve any of this. As the Scotch Whisky Association made very clear in their statement, the tariffs mean that Scotch whisky is now paying for over 60% of the UK's tariff bill for the subsidies it provides to Airbus, 8 times more than the next most valuable UK product on the tariff list. And this whole episode shows just how unhelpful Scotland's political association with Westminster can sometimes prove to be. Scottish businesses are, in this case, paying the price for that association. And this is before we even consider where the UK might be headed or might be taking us in terms of tariffs on its European adventure ahead. The Scottish Government has made every effort to engage with UK ministers on the question of tariffs, but the UK Government's attention seems to be elsewhere, if it is anywhere at all. This trade dispute once again highlights the need for Scotland to have some say over these questions, as of course we would as an independent country, whatever one of the more miserable amendments before us today may think about that issue. Presiding Officer, Scotland values its trade with the US, as I say. Indeed, we value it too much to trust an unelected Tory government to negotiate a trade deal for us with the United States. These tariffs make me wonder what a post-Brexit trading environment would look like for Scotland. Bad for Scottish businesses, bad for Scottish jobs, bad for the Scottish economy, and bad for Scotland. More widely, to conclude, Presiding Officer, in the long term, it should make anyone ask whether protectionism and trade wars work for anyone, a question which both the White House and Downing Street would do well to consider.
Thank you very much. And I now call Alec Rowley to be followed by Joan McAlpine. Mr Rowley,
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Many in this debate today have been quite rightly critical of Donald Trump and his willingness to use trade and tariffs as a weapon of attack against any country that crosses him or does not fall into line with the world in the eyes of Trump. Trade and the ability to trade is what one might say makes the world go round, and yet it is not a subject much talked about around the dinner table or even down the pub. Indeed, the issue of trade was not an issue of widespread discussion during the Brexit referendum, and yet for the right-wing Tory party it was their main goal, their main driver in their desire to get out of Europe. This dispute we are debating today has its roots in an argument about aircraft subsidies and indirectly to steel and aluminium imports. It is also, to many observers, a symptom of the protectionist American first philosophy of the Trump administration. The Office of the US Trade Representative announced the imposition of tariffs on a wide variety of imported goods from the European Union nations, 10% on large civil aircraft and 25% on agriculture and other products, including single malt whisky and single malt whisky from Northern Ireland. These tariffs are the result of a World Trade Organization judgment, the largest in its history, that the US should be allowed to impose tariffs worth just under $7.5 billion a year against EU nations linked to a trade dispute that goes back 15 years. The 25% tariff has the potential to seriously damage the Scottish whisky industry and the wider Scottish economy as a whole. Some key points to note are that Scotland had 280 distilling-related business local units in 2019. 23 out of Scotland's 32 local authorities have distilling businesses present, including many wonderful distilleries across mid-Scotland and Fife. The spirits industry contributes approximately 1.4% to total Scottish GDP, and the industry employs around 10,000 people. Scotland is home to 133 malt and grain distilleries, making it the greatest concentration of whisky producers anywhere in the world. And that is why both the UK and Scottish governments must do everything within their power to de-escalate the situation and find a solution. Scotland's economy and labour market is fragile enough without imposing more tariffs that could close down the country's distillery business, forcing people into unemployment and leaving communities worse off. But this latest episode does demonstrate just how fragile the global economy can be and is. The United States have argued that the UK, France, Germany and Spain breached the World Trade Organization laws by providing launching aid to the European aircraft maker Airbus, and hence the tariffs that are now being imposed on us. It is also the case that the EU imposed a 25% tariff on imports of US whisky in retaliation to Trump's tariffs on steel and aluminium from China and Europe. The Scottish Whisky Association has noted that the European Union imports of US whisky then fell by around 20% as a result of those tariffs. So the risk for our economy are very real, not to mention the risk to the production of shortbread and cashmere knitwear, which is also included in the latest tariffs being imposed by the US and threaten further thousands of jobs here in Scotland. Therefore, as many have said, these punitive tariffs have the potential to seriously damage the Scottish whisky industry, food and textile industries across Scotland, imposing a wider economic risk to our country as a whole. The future of companies, jobs and communities across Scotland will be put at risk by these tariffs. Average turnover for Scottish distilleries was approximately £5.3 million, and the industry employs around 10,000 people, and Scotland's fragile economy and labour markets simply cannot afford to lose such lucrative businesses. Our amendment also points to the fact that the SNP have a history of supporting Trump's approach to business. Just ask the people of Aberdeenshire, where every credible environmental group in the land was objecting to the Trump development, warning that it would destroy protected sites of special scientific interest. The SNP might not like that fact, but it is nevertheless a fact. And finally, Presiding Officer, I ask, how can it be that the SNP are desperate to separate from our largest market, the rest of the United Kingdom, at a time where 60% of our trade goes to the rest of the UK. And at a time where we are feeling directly the impact of trade's Trump wars around the world, it makes absolutely no sense. This example in Brexit is an example of why we need to be taking walls down, not building walls, breaking borders down, not building borders.
Thank you very much, Mr Rowley. I call Joan McAlpine to be followed by Brian Whittle. Ms McAlpine, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It is the distillery employee, the artisan cheesemaker, the textile worker and other vulnerable employees and businesses that will pay the price of this ongoing trade war. As the 15-year Airbus-Boeing saga rumbles on, businesses around Europe are reeling from the new WTO-sanctioned tariffs imposed by the US. Textiles are an important industry for the south of Scotland, indeed Scotland as a whole, and they are particularly affected. There are 550 textile companies in Scotland with 22,000 employees, and the sector accounts for 7% of our exports. And of course, textiles is a hugely important sector for the Borders economy in my South Scotland constituency, including the town of Hawick, where this has caused grave concern. Borders is a byword for luxury when it comes to cashmere and wool. Chanel, Pringle of Scotland and Leyland Scott knitwear products are in high demand around the world, and garments from the likes of Hawick Cashmere, Hawick Knitwear, Holland and Sherry, House of Cheviot, Johnsons of Elgin, Lochgarron, Shorts of Hawick and Hoyco are highly valued in many foreign countries. I understand that David Sanderson from Hoyco has been pressing hard for these tariffs against these tariffs at all levels of government, but as others have said, this is a game of hardball. And if I may quote the UK Fashion and Textile Association CEO Adam Mansell, he said recently, waiting for the outcome of a potential free trade agreement with the US is not enough. We need the government to take action now to support our manufacturing industry. Operating within WTO rules or not, the object of a trade tariff is to frustrate international trade and make it more difficult for exporters to send and sell abroad. The US choice of an opportunistic, relatively high 25% tariff says a lot. Play by our rules or we will hit you hard. Consumers in the US must pay inflated prices for those goods or buy local. But of course you cannot in the US buy local for Scotch whisky yet. Tariffs are bad news for all businesses dragged into this trade war, but Scotch whisky feels especially vulnerable, and Scotch whisky isn't just a Speyside, Highland or Island product. In Dumfries in Galloway, for example, in my South Scotland region, we have Bladnoch whisky in Wigton and the Annandale distillery, whose two single malts, Man of Sword and Man of Word, are produced just a few miles north of the border at Gretna and have been really important for the transformation of the town of Annan near where they are situated. Scotch is unique, sold without peer in 180 markets around the world and worth 1.04 billion in 2018. A third of that is single malt sales, and these are now subject to the 25% tariff. Before Brexit was a dangerous ripple in the Tory party consciousness, the EU in 1992 introduced protected geographical indicators to protect goods. As others have said, there are 18 Scottish products and 86 protected UK food names, and a GI gives a competitive advantage and adds value. It stands for quality, authenticity, and it prohibits imitation. And of course, Scotch whisky has GI status, but for how long? The US has long had its eye on Scotch whisky in terms of competition with its own now burgeoning whisky market. Whisky sales, that is, bourbon sales, are second only to vodka in the States. At around 1/7 of the sale of Scotch whisky, US whisky sales are enjoying a renaissance, growing by almost 9% between 2017 and 18, and sales will rise further according to experts in the industry. Bourbons and craft whiskies from around the globe are rising in popularity too. In this growth market, taken with the trade war, 25% tariff imposed on US whisky in 2018 by Europe and its trading partners, it's no coincidence that more single malts are feeling the pressure of that. The Scottish Whisky Association is of the view that the new tariffs will undoubtedly damage the sector. A 21% drop in single malt exports to the US would see income drop from $344 million to $272 million. A lot depends on whether distillers, importers or consumers absorb extra costs, which may happen in the short term in respect of high-quality, much-loved brands. Distillers say that the smaller players will suffer as they work with smaller US importers who do not have the financial muscle to absorb extra costs. There is a clear threat to the 11,000 Scotch whisky jobs in Scotland, particularly the 7,000 jobs in rural communities where the impact of tariffs may be felt most. The reality is that Scotch whisky and all Scottish businesses on the tariff list face a double threat from Brexit and from the trade war already 15 years in the running. We will and should keep trading successfully with the US. That is what the Scottish employees and businesses want. The US is the destination of 17% of our global trade, and exports are growing fast. This is a bitter taster of how vicious trade wars can become. We know, as things stand, that the UK government will not publish texts of proposed future trade agreements prior to ratification, and that Scotland's consent will not be sought in UK trade negotiations after Brexit, and that parliamentary scrutiny and consent of free trade deals will be denied. The Scottish Government is right to keep up the pressure on UK Government ministers over both post-Brexit trade arrangements and ending this trade war. Ordinary Scots are under threat from Brexit and the vagaries of a Trump administration only intent on putting America first. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now call Brian Whittle to be followed by Gordon MacDonald. Mr Whittle, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak in this very important debate. Now, we are aware of the background to the issues that have led us to this chamber. Basically, both the EU and the US have claimed that Airbus, in the case of the EU, and Boeing, in the case of the US, have been unfairly subsidised by each side. It's worth noting that Airbus, of course, is owned jointly by Germany, France, Spain and BAE Systems in the UK. Subsequent to these accusations, the WTO has upheld both sides' claims and has ruled that the US can impose tariffs on EU goods. And as has already been said in the Chamber, they are expected to rule that the EU can impose similar tariffs on the import and export of US goods into the EU. However, the motion that the Government put forward that we are currently debating, I think, is a bit of a puzzle. Quite how the Scottish Government have managed to shoehorn Brexit into an EU-US trade dispute will be beyond nearly all but their most ardent supporters. I think most will also recognise this debate for the SNP is basically blatant politicking rather than actually tackling the serious issue this dispute raises and helping to find a solution for constituent businesses. Because the reality is, Deputy Presiding Officer, however the SNP try and manufacture a grievance, Brexit has absolutely nothing to do with this trade dispute, and it is shameful that they try to misinform the public and leverage their narrow independence agenda into everything. And I was listening to Emma Harper's Ratpoo speech. I mean, reality here, you know, there is not a chance. Yes, the reality is not, but that doesn't mean to say we have to set the standards. To trade with us, any trading partner will have to conform to UK standards. We don't have to accept them. And I'll tell you this.
I'm glad you're... Excuse me a wee minute. Just the two of you sit down. I mean, you know, it's not a wee conversation between the two of you, delightful though that may be. I'm not sitting here just as a passive observer. So please speak through the chair and do interventions. You may continue, Mr Whittle. I
apologise, Deputy Presiding Officer. If I could just finish that, we do not have to accept any trading partner who doesn't conform to our UK standards. And as I have to say to the Mike Rumbles of the undemocratic Liberal Democrats, the reality is that we're on the side of democracy, and when if you have a vote and the majority of people vote that one way, I think it's incumbent upon us to accept the vote of the public and go with their intentions. As has been mentioned, sorry, if you want to intervene, please jump up.
I have to ask if there's a little convention in here. Would you like to just address it properly? Are you taking an intervention, Mr.
I'll
Whittle?
take an intervention.
Thank you. Mr Allen.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Well, in that case, I'll merely say, by way of intervention, what I said from a sedentary position, which is, what about Scotland? The member talks about the majority that was achieved in the European referendum, without even considering the possibility that Scotland might have a view.
Mr Whittle.
Thank you for that. It gives me the opportunity to explain to the member that neither Scotland, England, Ireland or Wales is a member of the EU. The UK is a member of the EU, and every single person in the UK's vote was equal, and the UK voted to leave the EU, much against what I campaigned for and you campaigned for. But that, sir, is democracy. As I've mentioned, among the Scottish goods in which the 25% tariff has been imposed includes whisky and woollen goods. And, Deputy Presiding Officer, members may be interested to know that every piece of knitted Harry Potter merchandise in the world is manufactured exclusively in Stewarton by Lochhaven International of Scotland. So for any families trailing around the Universal Studios in Florida and any other parks that the Gryffindor scarf that you're purchasing actually began life probably not too far from your house. Now, I have visited them a few times as they're in my area and right next door to where I hold a surgery from time to time. It is quite remarkable, and I think it's well worth a visit. However, the MD Colin contacted me when this trade dispute began. He wanted to flag up how this would affect him and asked if I would help. Now, business will always find a way, and they're exploring the option of registering an office in the US to minimise import tariffs. It's not ideal and not without cost, but a solution nonetheless. Now, I was aware that John Lamont, that MP just about to be retaining his border seats, would have a similar issue in his border constituency. So I contacted him to see what he was able to do in helping bring my constituents' concern into the dispute.
Did you just whistle past me about electioneering there for someone?
I would never do that.
I think you tried. You didn't succeed. Don't do it again.
Okay, sorry, Deputy Presiding Officer. John's shared a letter with me that I had received from the Right Honourable Elizabeth Truss, who's the Secretary of State for International Trade and President of the Board of Trade. In that response, the Secretary is clear that resorting to tariffs is not in the interests of the UK, EU or the US, and the UK Government is working closely with our European partners to secure a negotiated settlement to these disputes and avoid tariffs before they really bite. Additionally, the UK Government are seeking confirmation from the WTO that the UK has fully complied with the WTO rulings regarding support to Airbus and should not be subject to additional tariffs. The Secretary further states that the issue of tariffs has been... the Secretary further states that the issue of tariffs has already been raised at the highest levels of US administration. Ms Truss has been in discussions with the US Trade Representative Lighthizer, Commerce Secretary Ross and Vice President Pence. The Chancellor raised Airbus tariffs with the US Secretary to the Treasury, Mnuchin, and the Prime Minister raised the issue with President Trump during his state visit in June. I'll take it.
Minister.
Second time I've heard this kind of sleight of hand where Conservative members seem to be implying that somehow the UK is not liable for these tariffs by indicating that somebody's having a conversation with somebody about it. The reality is, the member should know this, and if not, you should go and check it, the UK is liable along the rest of the EU members for these tariffs that the US imposed on them, and it was the US that decided which countries and which products they were going to place tariffs on, precisely because those are the countries involved in the Airbus subsidies.
We have time in hand, Mr Whittle. So you will
I would have thought the Minister would understand that the UK is compliant with WTO rules. It's the other EU countries that are non-compliant that we are being lumped in together with that. That's a fact, and I thought, Minister, you would know that. Throughout this trade dispute, I've been able to keep my constituent appraised of action that has been taken to address their serious concerns. That is how you effectively work and collaborate with colleagues to leverage solutions. Whether we are in or out of the European Union, this issue remains. It is absolutely shameful attempt by the ineffective Scottish Government to shift attention away from its failings in this parliamentary term. What happened to its commitment to education, health and justice? As was said only last week, where are the government's debate on these issues? Week in, week out, by your own actions, you're showing your true colours. No matter what the issue, independence is the only solution. And it's a mantra the SNP are hiding behind to avoid scrutiny. It's a mantra they hide behind to avoid responsibility. The Scottish Conservatives will continue to seek a viable solution with our colleagues in Westminster for the sake of all of our Scottish industries affected by this trade dispute. That, Deputy Presiding Officer, is what standing up for Scotland's interests really looks like.
Thank you. I call Gordon MacDonald. Mr MacDonald is the last speaker in the open debate. Mr MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I remind members that I'm the co-convener of the Scotch Party Group, cross-party group on Scotch whisky. Whisky is worth nearly $5 billion in annual exports, accounting for 70% of Scotland's food and drink exports and 21% of Britain's. The US is the largest single market, with over $1 billion of whisky exported there last year, including £344 million of single malt whisky. As others have said, our whisky industry is facing the 25% US tariffs as a result of the World Trade Organization dispute between the EU and the US that began in 2004, relating to aircraft subsidies paid by EU countries, including Britain. The WTO issued its final ruling last month, stating that the US can be authorised to apply tariffs worth $7.5 billion annually on the EU countries that subsidise Airbus. These are the UK, France, Germany and Spain. So Scotland's whisky industry, which has been imported tariff-free to the United States since 1994, is being caught up in a dispute that has nothing to do with it. Not only that, but Scotland's whisky industry is paying over 60% of the UK's tariff bill for the subsidies it provided to Airbus. And as Alistair Allen said, 8 times more than the next valuable UK product on the tariff list. This comes at the same time as the industry is facing potential access barriers or tariffs into the EU as a result of the Tory Brexit shambles, creating the biggest threat to Scotland and the UK's economy, taking us out of the single market, which is 8 times the size of the UK alone. The EU region has 500 million people who currently purchase 1.4 billion of our whisky. The result of our removal from the single market and US tariffs is a double whammy for the whisky industry, where access to 2 of their biggest markets are being undermined by decisions of the previous Tory government. Presiding Officer, so concerned is the spirit sector over US tariffs that 15 of the beverage alcohol trade associations from across the world, including the American Distilled Spirits Association and the Wines and Spirits Wholesalers of America, signed a letter which was sent to the EU Commission and to the Executive Office of the President, condemning the imposition of tariffs on Scotch whisky. They warned, as a result, these new US tariffs on EU spirits and wines could result in the loss of 8,000 good-paying jobs across the US beverage alcohol sector, from importers, distributors, wholesalers to the hospitality sector. And if that's the potential impact in the US, then we need urgent action whenever the new UK government is formed to protect our rural economies. Their letter continues, this open access to each other's markets has significantly benefited EU and US distillers, vintners, farmers and the hospitality industry on both sides of the Atlantic, resulting in increased jobs, community investment and consumer choice. And Scotland has benefited from increased investment to try and meet the demand for whisky, with 7 new distilleries starting production in 2017, another 4 opened in 2018, a further 5 will begin production this year, with many more in the pipeline for next year. With this level of investment continue with the impact of American tariffs and Tory Brexit, will we lose market share? Who knows? But what we do know is that major owners of Scotch whisky are already investing elsewhere. Ireland is excluded from the new US tariff rules and has in recent years been increasing its whisky output. In 2013, there were only 4 operational distilleries, but this year they opened the 24th operational Irish whisky distillery, the Killowen Distillery in County Down. Sales of Irish whisky has increased by 39% between 2013 and 2017, with the value of spirits exports from Ireland exceeding €1 billion for the first time ever in 2018. So who's funding this expansion in Ireland? Diageo, who is the world's biggest whisky producer with malt whisky distilleries across Scotland producing Glenkinchie, Cragganmore, Talisker, to name but a few, is to launch a new premium whisky distillery at St James Gate in Ireland. Pernod Ricard is the second largest Scotch whisky producer in the world, with 10 distilleries, including anchor brands Glenlivet and Aberlour. It recently announced it was spending more than €150 million in Irish distillers Middleton Distillery in Cork and a bottling plant in Dublin over the next 2 years. As the Scotch Whisky Association said in their press release, we expect to see a negative impact on investment in Scotland and longer-term impacts on productivity and growth across the industry and our supply chain. Presiding Officer, we need to find a solution to this trade dispute over Airbus as quickly as possible, bearing in mind it's taken 15 years to get to this point, and that our market share is under threat from other countries. The US Trade Representative is legally obliged to review the retaliation list after 120 days and every 80 days thereafter. This presents an opportunity for the tariffs on the affected products to be lifted. The previous Tory government proved unable to provide a vital protection for a vital Scottish export industry. Therefore, the Scottish Government and this Parliament must have a meaningful role in the development and agreement of any future trade arrangements to ensure that Scotland's interests are protected and promoted.
Thank you. And to closing speeches, I call on Rhoda Grant to close for Labour. Ms Grant, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The bright side of this debate, indeed, if there is a bright side, was that it gave members a platform to advertise the excellent products that come from their constituencies. And I think almost everyone who spoke spoke about their own area and the products that they provide. And I think the downside of that, though, was it showed very starkly how much of Scotland is impacted by those tariffs. I think if everyone in the debate was speaking about companies that were impacted, it shows the degree of difficulty we're facing. The importance of de-escalating this situation was highlighted by Alec Rowley and indeed by many others in this debate, including Gordon MacDonald, who made that case just now. Escalating it hurts us all, and we need to find a way of de-escalating it and getting those tariffs removed. Many speakers talked about whisky, which actually does bear the brunt of these tariffs, so it's not surprising that this was spoken about by most people who contributed to the debate. David Stewart made the point that it disproportionately impacts on small distilleries because they produce malt whisky rather than blended whisky, which isn't affected by this. And there's many small distilleries springing out all around Scotland, as I said in my opening speech, producing gin at the moment, but they will be producing malt whisky, and they're creating jobs in many of our small communities. Alistair Allen talked about one especially close to my heart, the Harris Distillery, producing wonderful gin at the moment, and it will go on to produce wonderful whisky in the future. And they employ 40 people, which in a small place is a huge number of jobs, and high quality jobs at that. But as Alec Rowley pointed out, 10,000 people throughout Scotland are employed in the whisky industry. And it is somewhat wrong that this industry is bearing the brunt of the UK's liability. Peter Chapman pointed out that 62% of the liability for the whole of the UK is being borne by Scottish whisky. A number of speakers made the point that malt whisky is matured in bourbon barrels, which are bought directly from the US. And that seems to me to point out how strange that these tariffs are, because it will actually directly impact back on bourbon producers in the US, because they will lose some of their market for their barrels here. The point was also made that the EU did place tariffs on bourbon, and that was highlighted by the Scots Whisky Association in their briefing to us for this debate, because they have continually campaigned against those tariffs and sought for them to be removed. Again, the unfairness of them being caught up in all of this because they were against the tariffs on bourbon in the first place. Seems to have been, that point has been made in the debate. Dean Lockhart and Edward Mountain talked about the Conservative Party's plan to review taxes on whiskies. And I suppose I have a number of questions around that. How does that interact with other spirit sales? What is its purpose? Is it to help it gain or increase an overall market share, or indeed just make it more affordable to people so that people drink more whisky? But malt whisky is a luxury brand, so to lower the cost in comparison to other spirits could damage that reputation. So while we don't want to encourage people to drink more alcohol, neither do we want to damage the reputation as a luxury brand of malt whisky. So I look forward to hearing how that actually would work. It makes a very good soundbite, but I'm not so sure it's such a simple issue. Other speakers talked about other support that should be available to whisky distillers, and indeed some of those things would impact on others that were affected by those tariffs. Improved broadband, and I would make a plea for improved ferry services, especially for places like Islay, which have a huge number of distilleries and depend on ferries. But it's not just about whisky, it's about biscuits, it's about foodstuff, wood products and the like, even Harry Potter scarves. All these companies are impacted, maybe not to the degree of whisky, but their businesses will be damaged. Our amendment talked about Trump, and Alec Rowley talked about his business at the Many Estate and how this should have warned us about how Trump operates. The Scottish Government should have been really wary of doing business with him rather than rolling out the red carpet. And Ruth Crawford had pointed out that Trump will only negotiate with the UK if we have a no-deal Brexit. And that's a very dangerous situation to be in. And Jenny Gilruth quoted Trump as saying trade wars are easy to win. Yes, of course they're easy to win if you're the largest market. And that should warn us very much about doing business with Trump and how he operates. This debate was about the trade tariffs, but Brexit was widely debated as well. And there's no doubt that Brexit will damage our trade. And it's already having an economic impact just because of the pure uncertainty of it. It will not be done by the 31st of January. There is no way it will be done by then. There will be years of negotiations to take ourselves out of the EU and develop a new relationship with them. And it's important we develop that trading relationship. And David Stewart, in his speech, pointed out that we need to negotiate then our own trade deals with other countries. And we'll be facing other countries who are expert in negotiating their own trade deals because we have depended on the EU in the past to negotiate for us. It's not going to be as easy as we think, especially when we know now that the WTO is no safety net. The whole Brexit saga should sound a warning for those who seek to break up the UK. How on earth can the SNP not see this? What this debate has taught us is the importance of trade, and we need to be able to trade freely as possible while maintaining the standards of the produce we take in. And that's why we need to keep all our trade...
the members in their last 30 seconds.
That is why we need to keep all our trading partners close, Europe and even more importantly the rest of the United Kingdom. And as Alec Rowley said, we need to break down borders, not build them.
Thank you very much. And I call on Jamie Halker-Johnson to close the Conservatives.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Despite a number of the issues raised by this debate, most of us could actually find common cause on this subject of tariffs. Looking at international trade, I think most of us can see that the imposition of tariffs and quotas and counter-tariffs on goods benefit no one. The United Kingdom has long been a champion of free trade on the global stage. The ability to trade freely has not only created jobs and built prosperity, but has also aided the creation of a truly international marketplace of ideas, collaboration and progress. The dispute over support given to Airbus and to Boeing long predates the current US administration, and it predates the current British government too, with its origins back in the first half of the 2000s. We are extremely disappointed with the US approach on the issue. From the European side, the UK government has been sincere in its attempts to bring support for industry into the state of compliance with WTO rules. Our European partners and the United States should be similarly working to achieve that and to ensure that trade continues to flow. The WTO is expected to make a ruling in a few months' time, but in the meantime, we should avoid escalating this dispute. That goal has been the subject of high levels of engagement between our own government and the American administration, including the Prime Minister and the US President. And I know that their predecessors have also been involved in similar discussions over the dispute. The main tariff raised today in the Chamber has been on Scotch whisky. This is understandable given the position of this sector in Scotland. Scotch whisky has been a great Scottish success story, alongside our wider Scottish and UK food and drink sector. My own region, the Highlands and Islands, produces many of Scotland's finest malts, including those from Speyside and from the Isles. Exports of whisky to the United States are together worth around $1 billion, single malts representing a significant proportion of that figure. The US currently accounts for over a fifth of all Scotch whisky exports from this country. This is also an industry that can ill afford high tariffs. It operates on a model that is largely reliant on small and medium-sized businesses operating distilleries, as David Stewart said. However, it employs around 11,000 people, and the knock-on benefits of the industry to Scotland are even greater. We've also heard particularly of the impacts that tariffs will have on goods such as shortbread, produced notably by Walkers in my region, Scotland's cashmere exports, again a noted Highland export, or our local cheeses and other foods. But of course, the main point of dispute, the aerospace industry, will also be affected here in the UK too. And this matters. We've seen for too long a lack of internationalisation in Scotland's businesses, with too few supported to export and many finding barriers to becoming significant exporters. Here in Scotland, we should be seeing greater cooperation with business, our enterprise bodies and the Department for International Trade to ensure that exporting is as simple a process as possible. Now, looking around the Chamber, my colleague Dean Lockhart spoke of some of the issues that have been raised in the cross-party group on the USA. He also acknowledged the Scotch Whisky Association's figure that exports of single malts to the US could fall by 20% a year if these tariffs continue to operate, at considerable cost to the sector here in Scotland. And he also touched on a number of practical steps that both the UK and Scottish governments could take to mitigate some of the pressure on the Scotch whisky industry in coming months if tariffs are not removed. Rhoda Grant highlighted the potential impact on our own region of the Highlands and Islands. And David Stewart, I thought rather bravely, wandered into the age-old debate in Orkney over Scapa or Highland Park. I will just say that both of them are excellent when drunk in moderation. Peter Chapman spoke on the impact of tariffs on the North East, as well as the UK government's freeze on spirit duty, as Edward Mountain also did. And Edward Mountain, my fellow Highlands and Islands MSP, of course, also touched on measures that have been taken to support the Scotch whisky industry, which is so important to our region. Many of these could and should have been done already. Unfortunately, whisky suffers from many of the problems faced by other businesses in remote and rural areas of Scotland. Serious investment in infrastructure must be made, including in terms of rural broadband, as Mr. Mountain highlighted, to help these businesses operate globally and to drive down production costs. He also examined some of the areas in which the UK government has been actively promoting and supporting Scotch whisky in recent years. The Prime Minister has announced a review of alcohol duty rates. This was a key ask from the Scotch Whisky Association and one that has been welcomed. The UK government also hopes to provide more certainty with a multi-year plan for the future of alcohol duty as we leave the EU. Alex Rowley highlighted, I think, the SNP's rather uncomfortable relationship with the businessman Donald Trump before he became the President of the United States. And Mike Rumbles spoke about his opposition to Brexit, and I believe that is genuine. I do accept his position on that. But he must remember that a referendum on our membership of the EU was Lib Dem policy for a long time, and the Liberal Democrats voted for the referendum bill. Brian Whittle spoke about how his area is the home of much Harry Potter merchandise, again nailing his colours to Team Gryffindor, which again I thought was brave. If maybe, yes.
Mike Rumbles.
Won't he, that it is the UK government that put a leaflet through everybody's letterbox saying that they would implement the results of the referendum. The bill that went through Parliament was advisory, and Parliament was not committed to it, obviously.
Jamie Harker-Johnson.
I think most people knew what they were supporting and knew what they were what the referendum was going to take. And as I say, I'm afraid Mr Rumbles cannot take away from it. It was Liberal Democrat policy. The Liberal Democrats supported the referendum bill. The only thing they haven't supported is honouring the result. This situation highlights the... If I can move on. This situation highlights the importance of a clear and open approach to international trade. And as I've said, tariffs and quotas are in nobody's interest. Breaking down the barriers to trade benefits us all. We must not find ourselves drawn into disputes that are seen as a zero-sum game. One nation raising tariffs, followed by others countering with their own tariffs, harms both parties. This should be foremost in our minds as Britain sets out to create new trade agreements around the world. And that's why the SNP's tacking on a sentence attacking Brexit to today's motion is rather crass and opportunistic. It belittles an issue of real importance to businesses across Scotland, because this is a dispute between the United States and the European Union, one in which the United Kingdom and Scotland has been caught. We don't want a battle over trade. We want to work together to resolve the dispute that gives rise to these tariffs and to see them consigned to the dustbin as soon as possible.
Thank you. And I call on Fergus Ewing to close for the Government. Cabinet Secretary till 5 o'clock, please.
Presiding Officer, I do welcome the support shown, I think, by most members across the Chamber for companies affected by these tariffs. I think that the main substance of this debate was well expressed by various members who pointed out the extremely serious impacts that these tariffs will have. And I think they were right to do so. I think Mr Stewart did so at length. Dr Allen did so. Bruce Crawford did so. Ed Mountain, in the first part of his speech, chose to do so. And that's quite right, because this is a very serious situation. And I'm pleased that we've had the opportunity to debate it, because I know from my discussions, which I'll come on to shortly with companies, that this is a very serious threat to many businesses, mostly in the rural economy in Scotland, and covering, as members have said, some of the most iconic and important sectors of our economy. And it touches just about every part of Scotland: the distilleries and bakeries of Murray, the rural cheesemakers and island distilleries, the bottling plants and warehouses in Glasgow, the textile workshops in the borders. And I'm particularly concerned about the impact of these tariffs on remote and rural communities. And I think that was a concern which was expressed across the Chamber. And we've heard how many products found on the shelves all over the world are manufactured in towns and villages across rural Scotland. So I think it behoves us all to emphasise just how important these issues are that we're debating today to our people, our business, our society, our community, rural and island Scotland. I think it's also worth stressing something that perhaps wasn't mentioned as much as I thought it may be, just how important our trade relations are with the USA. We have had a long history with the USA in our relationship between citizens, between businesses, with trade, with exports and with imports. As was pointed out by Mr Crawford, I think the expansion of exports of Scotch whisky to the USA has been a dazzling success and a tribute to all of those involved. So too have been our salmon exports in aquaculture. And £5.5 billion of exports, I believe, to the US in 2017, and our #1 market for export growth. That's 5.5 overall. And the links between Scotland and the US could not be stronger in terms of trade and business. Morgan Stanley employs 1,100 people in Glasgow. Hewlett-Packard has been in Erskine for 25 years. GE Baker Hughes recently created a new centre of excellence in Montrose with 100 new jobs. I recently revisited for the umpteenth time LifeScan in Inverness, which Mr Stewart has a connection with as well. And he and I both know just how important it has been as, I think, possibly the largest private sector employer in the Highlands. And I know from my discussions with US managers and owners of these companies, or some of these companies, that they value doing business in Scotland. Scotland is a great place to do business. And therefore, I thought it sensible to place in the record a sentiment I hope is shared by us across the chamber, that although there is a very difficult and dangerous dispute, behind that there is a much stronger connection which will and should subsist. And I did do a little research of my own, and I found that Mike Pence, the Vice President of the United States, said this. He said, "The US wins when we trade and we export and import." And I hope, therefore, that that longer view will prevail in the resolution of this dispute. And I understand from my officials that there is litigation ongoing, which gives the opportunity for prompt resolution of this dispute. Obviously, all of us wish that the negotiations about that are conducted as quickly as is possible. But this debate is about trade tariffs. It's about trade tariffs imposed by the USA, but it is also perfectly legitimately, I think, about trade tariffs which may well result from a no-deal Brexit, would result from a no-deal Brexit, and it's right that we look at these tariffs as well. The impact of these tariffs would be very considerable. For example, EU tariffs of around 65% on fresh boneless beef and 53% on fresh bone-in lamb. For example, the UK's proposals to remove import tariffs on eggs, coming, I think, from the Ukraine, for example, would wipe out the sector in one fell swoop. And I recently have had extensive discussions with British egg representatives about this, and it would leave egg producers here who produce to higher welfare standards vulnerable to cheaper imports, which could lead consumers unwittingly eating eggs and eggs products that are produced to lower welfare standards. And this is a very real fear, and it was expressed by Emma Harper in her contribution, which was absolutely relevant. And I was pleased that, presiding officer, you confirmed that it was relevant, contrary to an assertion from another member to the contrary. Emma Harper.
Emma Harper.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for taking my intervention. I mean, I am concerned about food standards, so does the Cabinet Secretary share my concerns, given the debate we've just had about tariffs, about the USA's massive negotiating power, that we do need to be cognizant of food and drink standards coming our way with trade deals in the future with the USA?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, she is absolutely right. And just in case any members think that this is me describing inaccurately the position of the US in these matters, let me just read from the US published negotiating objectives for a no deal. They wish to, quote, establish a mechanism to remove expeditiously unwarranted barriers that block the export of US food and agricultural products. That is US policy. That is exactly what Emma Harper warned us about in her debate, which therefore, I submit, could not be more telling. Yes, certainly.
Brian Whittle.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for taking that intervention. I absolutely accept that is the USA's position. However, we don't have to accept that. And can I tell you that I have a farmer sitting next to me, and we will stand against any reduction in food standards. Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Stewart, please, let's hear a point of order from Mr. Whittle.
Sorry? Intervention yet. So that we do not have to accept any standards that the US try to impose upon us. It's to us to decide that.
Thank you. Fergus Ewing, Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I heard what Mr. Whittle said with interest. With great interest. Earlier on, reference was made by one of his frontbench colleagues to Liz Truss, whose ministerial responsibility. Now, Liz Truss is on record as quoting precisely the view that she wishes to remove regulatory impediments. She wishes to move towards the kind of trade which would not do what Mr Whittle wants. Exactly the opposite. Exactly the opposite of what he said. And this is a matter of open public dispute between ministers in the UK government, at least according to newspaper reports. Our position is very, very clear, and this is a matter that is of growing importance, Presiding Officer, that particularly farmers in Scotland are becoming concerned, and one of their main concerns is that we will see flooding of imports of meat from countries that have very little in the way of provenance and scant regard to animal welfare. And I've seen no evidence at all that the UK government has done anything in fact to prevent that. Let me conclude, Presiding Officer, by welcoming the opportunity in this debate to highlight the predicament facing people like Jim Walker, Managing Director of Walker's, the whisky industry, our cashmere sector, against these unwarranted tariffs imposed by the USA, and congratulate Mr McKee on his unstinting efforts to raise Scotland's case in America, in London and here, and wish him well for the success of those efforts.
Thank you very much, and that concludes this afternoon's debate, and we're going to move to decision time. There are 3 questions today. The first question is that Amendment 19851.1 in the name of Dean Lockhart, which seeks to amend motion 19851 in the name of Ivan McKee on implications of the imposition of US tariffs on Scottish products be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a division. Members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 19851.1 in the name of Dean Lockhart is yes 16, no 74. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that amendment 19851.2 in the name of Rhoda Grant, which seeks to amend the motion in the name of Ivan McKee, be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a division. Members may vote now. The result of the vote on amendment number 19851.2 in the name of Rhoda Grant is yes 16, no 74. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. And our final question is that motion 19851 in the name of Ivan McKee on implications for the imposition of US tariffs on Scottish products be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote and members may cast those votes now. The result of the vote on motion 19851 in the name of Ivan McKee is yes 74, no 16. There were no abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed. And that concludes decision time. I close this meeting.